Well, good evening, everyone. We are so excited to be back at the Lansing People's Assembly. We have really dedicated the last three assemblies to a specific topic that we want to make sure that we wanted to share this information with our community members and partners and friends and family. So on tonight, again, my name is Mordecai, and I'm going to be your proverbial host, so to speak. And so we want to welcome you to the Lansing People's Assembly. This is the fourth part in a community teaching series, which will include, we're really going to look at the information around the Ingham County prosecution data, and it's going to be broken down tonight in three specific ways. And so you don't want to miss tonight's presentation. Now, listen, for those of you all that are joining us online, we will be live streaming for the first 30 minutes of tonight's presentation. And so please make sure that you get the Zoom link information so you can jump into the Zoom as soon as we go off live, right? So that you can be a part of the discussions as well as the rest of the presentation. So one of the things we'd like to, again, welcome you to, this is government by the people and for the people. And this is where the collective, not the elective, set the agenda for our community. And so for our grounding, we'd like for you to put in the comment section online and here right in the Zoom, what are some of your thoughts and or reflections from the first three parts? And then the other question that we'd like to wrestle with and get some perspective on from our participants tonight is why would the Ingham County Sheriff Wigglesworth stand in opposition to the recent prosecutor policy changes which are supported by evidence, the evidence that has been presented to our community over the last three Lansing People's Assemblies. So I'm just going to park right here and introduce yourself online, introduce yourself here in the comment section. But please, let's fill up the comment section with thoughts and reflections, as well as can someone take a stab at this question? I mean, we always talk about the power of the facts and evidence and what does the data show. And so this is one of the questions we wanted to ground ourselves and open up with for this assembly. Why would the Ingham County Sheriff Wigglesworth specifically, and those that support, why are they in opposition to the recent prosecutor policy changes which are supported by evidence? So again, please fill up that comment section, and I'm checking the comment section as well. And as you are filling that out, we want to thank our sponsors again as to sponsor this four-part series. And our sponsors, again, as you can see, are on the screen. We want to thank our Liberation PAC, Black Political Power for Justice and Peace, One Love Global, the convener and host, Black Lives Matter Lansing, as well as our allies, TRHT Metro Lansing, the Village of Lansing as well. And so again, we want to thank you for sponsoring our assembly. So our assembly, again, we have the same agenda as last time: review the process and all the way down to review of where we left off. And then we're going to ask our partners from Vera to really give us that recap of where we left off, and then lay out what tonight's discussion is going to look like. Throughout tonight's experience, you will be able to type your questions in, your comments, right? Make sure that your voice is heard. So again, put your comments online, or you can put them right here in the Zoom link. So when we talk about the LPA, Lansing People's Assembly, right? The assembly is multiracial, generational, ideological, and multi-gendered. The assembly brings all the voices together in a circular fashion, engages the thinking, experiences, and visions of all the participants in order to synthesize and collectively agree on action steps. We've been meeting for over a year, and even in the midst of COVID, we've met virtually. We've met, I think, one time in a hybrid fashion. And so your voice matters. And so again, there were so many people who were like, well, this is not our responsibility. This is the elected officials' responsibility. No, this is our responsibility. We come together to set our agenda. The way we govern the Lansing People's Assembly, this is really everyone can take part, right? Whether you want to be a part of facilitating, doing the cultural work, the organizing, the documentation, space support, and participation. What I'd like for you to do is when you look on this screen, what role would you like to play? Because now that we've got the data, now that we've got the facts, so to speak, what we'd like to do is to continue to organize ourselves for as we begin to implement various strategies. So what role would you like to play in the Lansing People's Assembly? You see it on the screen there, put it in the comment section so that we can follow up with you after the session. Put it on the screen, put it in the comment section rather. What role would you like to participate or play? What are we building? What is the desire, the beloved community? Conditions that create crime and violence are no longer present, right? Tonight's presentation, parts 1, 2, 3, and 4, are part of our priorities that we set, right? The second outcome is outcomes that can no longer be predicted by race. That's what we are. That's our desire. That's what we're working towards. Number 3, racial hierarchy is no longer the norm. Everyone feels welcome and everyone feels safe. In one of our discussions, it was clear that only certain folks in our community are safe. And so we want everyone to feel safe and everyone to be welcome. We want to remind you that there's a brave new film series presents Racially Charged America's Misdemeanor Problem. The new date is Monday, September 20th at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. And so mark your calendars. Please be a part of this screening and this viewing of this film. So we wanted to remind you about the upcoming events. We do have our partners here from Vera, and I'm going to ask them to, I'm going to stop share, but Vera is doing an amazing work around the country, working with prosecutors, and so we want to bring our friends and family from Vera on to take us further. As you can see, again, we wanted to show you that we have been meeting for over a year, and we've been discussing many topics, and that's how we landed here with this particular subject, right? This is right in alignment with our priorities that the people have set in our assemblies. Our priorities: number 1, defund the police and invest those funds in community organizations. The question was, how do we reach community safety? Here it is, right? Ensure livable wages for all to meet basic needs without worry. We did a survey in our community. One of the major issues in our community right now is number 2 and number 1. That people said we don't have enough money to take care of the basic needs, right? And so it's very important that we ground ourselves in our priorities. And number 3, divert funds to community programs and mental health help for preventative measures. So these are our priorities. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop share. And I want to introduce Jack and Sarah and Andrew. It's been such a pleasure working with you all over the last months or so. I don't even know how long it's been now. And you all are absolutely amazing. And we want to introduce you to predominantly Metro Lansing and to Michigan, because we're going to throw this out wide. This is going nationwide. So again, the work that you do is so important. So Jack, I'm going to start with you, and then you can bounce it around.
Hey, thank you, Mordecai, and thanks again to inviting us into your space. We're really excited to be able to be here and help out and help you all in building and talking about what safety looks like in your community. So my name is Jack. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm one of the senior program associates. I work at a Reshaping Prosecution program at Vera, where we work with prosecutors' offices all across the country to help them kind of, figure out how to shrink the use of their power so that it causes less harm on Black and Brown communities in particular, and low-income communities. So in that work, we've been working with Carol's office for the past year on how to help, figure out how to do that. And these conversations with you all about, the data that we've been having is really critical to having that conversation, and really critical to helping, transfer the knowledge and empower y'all to help, see what's going on and how can you put your heads together and think about what safety, what you want safety to look like for you all. So I'm going to pass it over to Sarah to fill in any gaps that I probably forgot to mention, and then we'll pass it over to Andrew to pick up where we left off. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jack. It's really great to be here. Thank you all so much for having us here. I'm Sarah. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a program associate on the same team as Andrew and Jack. And Jack, I think I'm just going to second what you said about our work. And I think, Mordecai, it's been a little bit over a year that we've gotten the opportunity to work with y'all, and we're set to work with the office at least through the end of 2021. So we're really excited to have as many conversations about this data that is really y'all's data as possible in the next few months. And with that, I'll pass it to Andrew.
Great. And I'm Andrew, use he, him pronouns. And I'm the quantitative researcher on the team, which means I will be spending a lot of time talking today about the data. It's nice to see some familiar names on the Zoom panels here, who I think were here last time. Otherwise, just ditto everything that Jack and Sarah said. This is oftentimes the best part of my job, to present data to people who will hopefully do something with it, hopefully be a part of change ultimately.
Well, Andrew, I tell you, everyone that we have shared parts 1, 2, and 3 with, there are just major moments throughout the data presentation that just like a light bulb went off, like literally like aha moments, like are really like, how you live in a house and you think your home, and you hear all these narratives about how wonderful your home is, and this doesn't happen in my home, and then someone says, hey, let me give you an analysis of what your house looks like. And literally we've had leaders in our community that are like, wow, I mean, like literally outraged, right? And so I can only imagine if we've gotten those kinds of responses from the first 3 parts, and now here on tonight you're going to show it and depict it in a different way. So what can we kind of expect tonight? Because we've got people that are like, we had one person stand up and say we need to march downtown right now. They just had no idea that we had this level of inequity and disparities, right? And as much as we talk about it, as much as we write about it, when you put it up on the screen and you show the data, it is absolutely it's heartbreaking, right? To be on the downside of the underside of power. And so again, I just want to just say how much you all's work means to this community. So Andrew, I'm gonna turn it over to you, and I might break in and out, but we family now. After about a year, we're family. So we want our community to be engaged. So listen, as Andrew gets ready to share his screen and take us into this data, what we're asking you to do is to lean in, and we want you to really think about and who's centered in this data, right? The everyday lives of those that are most impacted. And so Andrew, I'm gonna bounce it over to you and take it away.
Great. Hey, thank you so much for the intro. I mean, it really can't say enough. It's inspiring to be able to have a chance to do this for people who are so engaged. A whole lot of my career prior to coming to Vera and doing this work has been spent writing reports that sit on shelves that only me and a few, senators' aides paid minimum wage have ever read. So it makes a big difference. We have a chance to see people who really want to engage with this work. All right, you can probably say this part with me. I'm going to ask the proverbial Zoom question. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Yeah.
Great. Well, let's see. I'll just jump right into this. As you can tell from the title here, primarily what we're going to talk about today will be findings specifically related to women and young adults. Those of you who saw me present last time, who were here for some of the previous presentations, what I'm going to say at this very intro is probably going to sound a little bit repetitive, but I think it bears repeating. Just an important frame that we take to all this work, and especially to the side of this, we do any analysis on, I am not an expert in Ingham County. I have never been to Ingham County. As far as I know, nobody at Vera is an expert in Ingham County. The one thing I am going to be able to show today is some analysis related to data from a prosecutor's case management system, and as that relates specifically to racial disparities in a few different junctions where the prosecutor has some power over what happens. That is but one piece of a much larger story about the experience of being in Ingham County, let alone the experience of also related to the criminal legal system in Ingham County. And so my hope really is that this will be a lot more of a conversation, a lot more of a discussion. Absolutely what questions, thoughts, feelings, reactions. We'll break periodically to talk about that or have some spaces at least throughout this conversation that we can do that with. Fact is, as I said, I'm not an expert, very much value the input of everybody else here. Jumping into this nonetheless, it's a little reminder, that's all of us again, or at least it was all of us a couple of months ago. You can see Jack, Sarah, and I. What am I actually going to talk about today? As I've kind of already said so far, but we'll talk about our findings specifically related to women and young adults. These are two populations within the overall criminal legal system that sometimes get left out when we look at differences and disparities with just the overall population, as we did last time. And then ultimately the whole purpose for doing this is that we want to talk about what's coming up next, everything that Mordecai was just talking about at the very beginning here. A little bit more specifically, what are we going to look at? Ultimately, we'll look at what are the warrant requests which are being submitted, what are the cases that ultimately get charged, what warrants get declined, and then what kind of warrants get diverted pre-charge. That's a bit of a jargony term. I'll explain what we mean by that when we get there. And of course, within each one of these areas, we're going to be specifically looking at the differences as they affect young adults. That's people ages 17 to 25, and to some extent, minors under the age of 17, and then also among women, to some extent, women as compared to men. Before we jump into that, I want to give you some sort of key findings here, just in case, to break the Zoom fourth wall for a second. Maybe you're listening to me, but also doing laundry or also cooking or being one of the many people on a Zoom call who is giving me their completely undivided attention. So no shade there. I've been on a lot of Zoom calls in the last 2 years. So if you don't remember anything else I say, I want these 5 things I'm going to give you to stick with you here, right? First, from 2015 to 2019, really in every single year in that period, which is the time period we spend most of our analysis in, we see that the overrepresentation of Black people is greater among young adults than it is among all other adults. I'll give you the specifics of that when we get there. We do see that there's been a decrease in warrant requests submitted against young adults. Again, that's warrant requests submitted against people who are ages 17 to 25. But almost all of this decrease has been within the misdemeanor caseload, or at least that's what it appears like with the data we have. And that disproportionately benefits white young adults as relative to Black young adults. Again, I'll give you the specific numbers when we get to those sections. We compared the declination rates. These are warrant requests which are submitted but are ultimately denied. We see that this kind of like we saw with the overall caseload, for those of you who might remember last time's presentation, so this has increased more rapidly for white young adults than for Black young adults. In fact, it's been nearly flat for Black young adults from 20 to 22% from 2015 to 2019, whereas for white young adults, the declination rate has increased from 20% to 27%. The very, probably the heaviest thing I'll talk about in this course of this whole presentation when we get to this section. So I'll bracket that off in a little bit here, but among all of the people who are under the age of 17, so these are kids, really. I mean, oftentimes people ages 15, 16 at the time of the offense that they're being prosecuted for. There's a relatively small number of these cases which are tried as adults and ultimately disposed as guilty, but all of those cases which were disposed as guilty in 2019 were for Black people under the age of 17.
Andrew, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead for your last one.
Okay. And then finally, when we look at differences between men and women, or specifically within women, there's a lot of areas there that I think really deserve more research, some things we hope to look into more, especially get some feedback from folks today. But some things that immediately stuck out to us there. So we see that domestic violence charges and charges related to assaulting a police officer, or in some cases, it's a strange mixture of assaulting a police officer and obstructing justice or resisting arrest, are very common types of charges filed against women, which I think raises a lot of questions, the sort of thing we want to jump into a little bit more. I don't know, Jack, was there something to add on these areas?
I just wasn't sure if we want to clarify why we have to use the gender binary and also the gender binary.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up now. I think I was going to get into it when we talked about the section of women in general, but to be really explicit, I mean, this is the outcome of the data we have in almost all criminal legal system data. There is only binary gender classification, and a lot of this stems from the way the gender is recorded in police reports and ultimately how it ends up in the databases that we have access to. I think, it's a very large conversation about how to change that and how to improve it. I think there are some really strong arguments for, say, not having the police do demographic surveys when they arrest people, or believing that even if they did that, they wouldn't be very accurate information. So I think it's a challenging thing to overcome in the kind of data that we use for this analysis, but I'm happy to have that conversation and at some point today if people are interested in it. But otherwise, no, we use a binary gender because it's what we're stuck with. All right. With that, and at the risk of sounding like a completely broken record for those who've heard me present many times now, before we jump into this, I will give 2 more housekeeping items. That's just how I like to do these data presentations, and I hope makes it better for everybody other than just me. The first of which is, if you have any clarifying questions, what do I mean by that? If I mumble, as I am prone to do, and you can't understand what I'm saying, ask me to repeat myself, interrupt me mid-sentence, do whatever you have to do to get my attention. I want you to be able to understand what I'm saying. If I talk to you for an hour and nobody understands what I'm talking about, it will be an extraordinary waste of all of our time. That's not what we want to do tonight. If you can't understand me, probably somebody else can't either. And so we'll all be better off if you ask those questions. Kind of the inverse of that, if you have a more substantial question, what do I mean by that? Something like, Andrew, have you thought about this hypothetical scenario? Have you considered getting data from this other place? Something like that. Those are really good questions. I definitely want to hear them. I think that's a lot of part of the feedback we want to get ultimately. But I'd ask if you can drop those in the chat, or else there are many times throughout this presentation where I'll prompt people for more questions and ask things there, leave them for those spaces. Just try to be a little bit more strategic with those because we have a ton of content to get through. We're better off trying to get through it all if we stay a little organized there. So ask clarifying questions, put complicated questions in the chat, or else wait until being prompted. Hopefully we'll get through everything on time. With that, we will jump into the actual findings for young adults. I remember here, I mean people from the ages of 17 to 25. Starting first with warrant requests submitted, that being all the cases which are referred to the office from law enforcement. This is before they make any decisions. That's something they might have a little bit of influence over in some sort of softer conceptions. What are we looking at here? This is the total number of warrant requests submitted from 2015 to 2019. The red shaded area on the top is for our 17 to 25-year-olds. The gray shaded area below that is the aptly named everybody else, or else all other adults if you prefer. I'm sure you can tell just by sort of eyeballing this. If you pay close attention to the slant at the top, you'll see the total number of warrant requests submitted has gone down, but you'll also be able to note that the proportion for young adults has decreased as well. Of course, if we look at the real numbers, we can confirm that. In 2015, 44% of all warrant requests submitted were submitted against young adults. It's our 17 to 25-year-olds. In 2019, that's down to 31%. The majority of this appears to be a decline in misdemeanor cases, although not all of it. And just to get the technical caveat out of the way, you may remember we don't have data on cases which were submitted but ultimately declined. We don't know what the charges would have been. So here we're technically looking at cases which were filed as opposed to just warrant requests submitted. And again, I can elaborate if anyone's interested. But if not, just to reinforce what I said about the decrease being mostly misdemeanors, on the left, what are we looking at here? This is the total number of misdemeanor cases filed. The red area on the top is again for young adults, and you can see in 2015, 46% of all misdemeanor cases filed were filed against young adults. It's down to 30% in 2019. In contrast, felonies are much lower and have remained fairly flat. You can see 35% of all felonies filed in 2015 were filed against young adults, down to 28% in 2019, which is still a decrease, but a much smaller one relative to the misdemeanors. If we break these down by the race and ethnicity of the people for whom these charges were filed against, you see that the benefit has been disproportionately large among white young adults as compared to black young adults. So the decrease for the misdemeanor cases filed has been fairly large overall, right? So let's look at the actual numbers there. In 2015, just over 1,100 misdemeanor cases filed were filed against white young adults. It's down to 442 in 2019. In contrast, for black young adults, there were 719 cases filed in 2015, down to 495 in 2019. But comparatively speaking, in 2015, filings against white young adults made up over half, or 55% of all cases filed, down to 45% in 2019, whereas a completely different change in the proportions for black young adults because the decrease has not been as severe. In fact, specifically, this change in the number of cases filed against white young adults from over 1,100 to about 440, it's about a 60% decrease, whereas this decrease from 709 to 495 is a 30% decrease, give or take. If we look at felony cases filed by race, we see a much larger overrepresentation of Black people. And we don't really see a severe change. We see about 1 percentage point change for both Black and white people over the time period. There's a slight decrease in cases filed, but it's very, very slight. And proportionally speaking, not much of a change. And so in either case here, we see a very large overrepresentation to Black people relative to the overall population of Ingham County, and we'll zero in on 2019 in a moment just to make that incredibly explicit. We can also pay attention to the extent to which these changes in misdemeanors have definitely not benefited Black and white young adults in the same way. Before we totally zero in on the demographics for 2019, give a little bit more contextual information about where young adults fit into just the overall caseload. I'll return to this chart a couple times tonight, but I just want to make it clear so we know about the size of the population we're talking about here. So what we're looking at here, one of the more complicated charts I'll probably ever show you. The height of each one of these bars represents the number of warrant requests submitted. The position here on the horizontal axis is the age of the person for whom the warrant request was submitted against at the time of their most serious offense was committed. Our shaded red area here, that's all of our young adults, 17 to 25-year-olds. This gray area going off towards the right, that's the aptly named everybody else or all other adults. And then this very small gray bar here, this is our people who are under the age of 17, but who are still submitted initially to adult court and in some cases tried as adults. We'll talk about them specifically at the end of this section. You see a small number, but a very serious number of cases there. For a moment, just zeroing in on the overrepresentation of Black people relative to white people among young adults, just to contextualize that for 2019, what that looks like as compared to the demographics of the county. For those of you who were here before, this is a familiar looking chart. It's a bar right here, sums up to 100%. Is the demographics of Ingham County of 2019 as according to the US Census. You can see 11% Black, 70% white. Not shown here, but about 11% Latinx and everybody else over there in that gray shaded area. If we look at the demographics of young adults who had a felony case filed against them in 2019, we see 62% filed against Black people, 29% against white people. Extraordinary overrepresentation relative to the population of Ingham County. And then if we look at felony cases filed against all other adults, we'd see 45% of these were filed against Black adults, 47% against white adults. In either case, significant overrepresentation of Black people, but greater among young adults than among all other adults. Think back to our key findings. So bullet point 1. We'd also see this is the same if we look at the misdemeanor caseload. So over here on the right, it's the same information, but it's the demographics here of young adults with a misdemeanor case filed against them. You can see 45% of those are Black in 2019, 40% were white. For all other adults with a misdemeanor case filed against them, 34% were Black, 55% were white. So really at any point here, there's large overrepresentation of Black people relative to the population of Ingham County. In some cases much larger, particularly among young adults. Those of you who saw this version of the presentation last time, you might notice I'm not talking about Latinx people very much. They're very small portions shown on these bars from the caseload here. Almost certainly this is to some extent a reflection of bad data. In some other instances, we use some methods of name prediction to try to compensate for this. But it's a bit of a complicated story and it's not a perfect solution. I'm happy to elaborate on why, but otherwise no. That's partly the reason we don't bring that up here today. So that was a lot of information. I'm about to transition to talking a little bit more about the types of cases which get filed against young adults and how there's a difference from all other adults and vary by race. But before jumping into that, any questions from what I just reviewed? Anything you want to see again? Any general reactions? I see the chat going off, but I can't actually check it with the way I've set up my computer today for some reason.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat that I know that you have the answer to because I asked the same question.
All right.
Is the racial breakdown here for Ingham County the full population or just the population of young people?
Excellent. Yeah, it's a really good question. This is the full population. However, I will tell you I've checked the population for the closest I can possibly get with the available census data to the same population. So when we use young adults here, to clarify, we're talking about 17 to 25-year-olds. If you've ever worked with census data, it's not always that easy to get specific age ranges. We can get, I think, 14 to 24-year-olds or 15 to 24-year-olds. We did check the aggregation, the breakdown of race and ethnicity there, and the short answer is it's basically the same as the prediction we see shown here for 2019. There are some minor differences. The proportion of Black young adults in the category from the census I mentioned there is basically the same. To some extent, the proportion of white young adults might be somewhat lower, as might be the number of Latinx young adults with a slightly larger proportion of Asian or people with other race and ethnicity that doesn't listen to it here. It's hard to say though. To some extent, the census estimates get a little bit imprecise at that point. So I think as a good rule of thumb, it's safe to assume that this is a good proxy. Any other questions I can answer now? All right, I'll just press on then. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the differences in the felony cases filed against young adults. At least that's what's shown on the left. In a moment, we'll look at what's filed against all other adults. Specifically, what's on this chart. This is the top 10 top felony charge categories. It's a very difficult thing to say quickly. Filed against young adults, as people ages 17 to 25. Specifically, what's shown in the numbers here is the total number of cases in which the most serious charge associated with that case is related to the category shown over here. And the percent is the percent of the total felony cases filed against young adults in 2019. So you can see up on the top, theft and stolen property is the number one, 15%. Below that, robbery and burglary type charges. There's weapons charges, and we call these weapons possession charges, primarily if that's the most serious charge. That would indicate that it's almost certainly not a crime of interpersonal violence. So that assault and battery, drug possession. It's assaulting a law enforcement officer. I want to be clear, that's the name of the category. The statute itself actually reads in a way that includes assaulting a police officer, but also resisting arrest and obstruction of justice. I'm not a lawyer. I can't tell you how, if that's as ambiguous as it sounds to me. I suppose that's an open question. Compare young adults on the left to all other adults on the right. We do see some big differences. Not huge, but noticeable, and with implications ultimately for where we're going to go, I think, in terms of what policies do we want to make to reduce disparities in these areas. For one thing, assault and battery being a little bit more common among all other adults. Theft and stolen property being a little bit more common among young adults. Some relatively large differences in drug possession, weapons possession as well, so on. But the lower the numbers get, the harder the comparisons get to be. If we look at misdemeanor cases filed as opposed to felony cases filed, the differences are a little bit less severe. Reason being for this primarily is that there's these top 4 categories account for nearly all misdemeanor cases which are filed by the office. You may recall these vehicular charges. Nearly all of these are driving with a suspended license. These domestic battery charges, I just want to be really clear, are not necessarily a complete representation of the burden of domestic violence in the caseload. Remind you that these are cases where it just means that the most serious offense associated with the case is a statute specifically related to domestic violence. There are a number of, say, felony assault cases, where by definition, the felony assault is more serious than the misdemeanor domestic violence charge. And so this can be a bit misleading. We've been working on getting better data to get a more comprehensive estimate of domestic violence, and I believe we have it. But knock on wood, we still have to work with it. Follow up with additional information that's clear as we can. Comparing young adults on the left to all other adults on the right. There's not as large differences here as we saw with the felonies, but worth pointing out nonetheless. Some slight differences in the domestic violence charges, as well as theft and stolen property, to some extent, along with traffic charges, vehicular charges as well. If we compare differences between Black and white young adults, here looking at felonies again, what we're looking at here on the left is the top 10 top felony charge categories filed against Black young adults. See again, just like we saw with the overall young adults, theft and stolen properties right up there at the top. Robbery and burglary below that. Right here are the top 10 felony charge categories filed against white young adults. I can see some pretty big differences. I mean, right up at the top, a big difference is in drug possession. Much more common with white young adults. Theft and stolen property, some smaller differences in assault and battery as well. A little bit larger was robbery and burglary, very large differences in sexual assault crimes. To some extent, weapons possession crimes too. If we look at differences among the misdemeanor cases filed, again, they're a little bit less severe, but still noticeable. So on the left here is the top 10 misdemeanor charge categories filed against Black young adults. And on the right is the same information, but as filed against white young adults. Some differences there in theft of stolen property, some bigger differences in domestic battery, very large differences in DUIs.
Andrew, we have a question.
Go ahead.
What sort of offenses would fall under the other category? I think they're referring to the other violations category, maybe.
That makes sense. Yeah, it's not a very well named category, is it? You can be mad at the person who named it because that's me. So I can work on that in the future. I think almost all of these are specifically related to violating some sort of conduct with an electronic device. And I believe that the office has explained these as being mostly related to, not really stated in the statute, but I think in practice, the way it often works is with somebody restricting access to somebody else's phone, for example. Something that I guess can happen in certain types of domestic violence cases. It's pretty rare, as you see, partly I think why it gets such an ambiguous name. But I'll also say we can provide a comprehensive list of statutes to categories too. I'd be very happy to get feedback on that. As a matter of fact, I sincerely doubt that they are perfect.
Andrew, we want to remind everyone that's viewing this via the live stream that we are going to end the live stream, and we're going to invite you to jump over into the Zoom. The Zoom link information will be placed in the chat as well as the comment section. And so please, you got to get over into the Zoom. And so thank you for joining us on our platforms. And we look forward to seeing you in the Zoom for the rest of the presentation. Andrew?
All right. Want me to just keep going, or should I give them 30 seconds or something?
Let's check the comment section to make sure that we've got all the questions here. And people are continuing to put, their reactions. So yeah, let's keep going.
Right. 1 second. All right, so moving into talking about warrant requests denied. Again, as a little bit of a reminder, what we're talking about with these particular section, these are all warrant requests which are submitted to the prosecutor's office, which are denied completely, meaning no charges went forward. There are a lot of reasons this could happen. Jack or any of the other attorneys who might be able to call here can keep me honest if my paraphrasing I'm about to give is not right. But there's a lot of reasons for this. First and foremost, it could be about the fact pattern of the evidence that's shown in the case. An attorney could decide there's no way that this meets the standard, that there's no reason to pursue these charges. It could also be about resources. Often offices have priorities for what kind of cases they want to devote staff time to pursuing, and other cases, and other types of cases that they don't. And I'm not aware of any office anywhere that's able to prosecute everything that comes in their door. Everybody makes resource-based constraint decisions about what they prioritize. And then ultimately it can be about broader conception of justice and whether or not pursuing this case fits philosophically into a broader question of, is this about pursuing justice in the interest of community? So what are we looking at here? Are all the warrant requests which are denied. Specifically on the red line here is the proportion of all warrant requests submitted which are denied that were submitted against young adults, are 17 to 25-year-olds. And above that in the charcoal line is everybody else, all the other adults anyway. What we see here is that they actually kind of converge in an interesting way. They both start out a little bit different, a little bit less likely against young adults in 2015, get to be very similar rates in 2019. Not entirely sure why that is, but to offer some speculation, it's possible that this is related to changes with misdemeanor drug possession, with the legalization of marijuana. Certainly possible that a lot of those cases would have previously been referred to a type of diversion program as opposed to declined outright. And by 2018 or 2019, there's a lot fewer of those cases coming into the office. It's a possible explanation, not necessarily one we can back up empirically. If we look at these differences by the race of the young adult for whom these charges were submitted against, this is almost a mirror image of what we saw with the overall caseload. And here we can see about 20%. Nearly the same rates for Black and white young adults in 2015, and then an uneven increase from 2015 to 2019. That's the point where 27% cases submitted against white young adults were a decline in 2019 relative to 22% for Black young adults. Questions on that last part there? Probably the briefest section I have. We'll press on ahead here then and talk about warrant requests diverted. At the very top, I said specifically this is talking about a type of diversion, which is pre-charge diversion. The important takeaway from that is that this is not all cases that are diverted by the office. This is just a specific type of diversion. And the reason being there is we don't have a good handle on the data for other types of diverted cases. So specifically, these are cases which are submitted to the office, which are then referred to a type of diversion program prior to the filing of any charges. And so long as the person meets whatever requirements are associated with that diversion, their charge will never be filed and they won't be prosecuted. This is in contrast to some other more common types of diversion programs folks might be aware of, things like drug courts, mental health courts, or veterans courts, if any of those are familiar. Those are programs in which charges are filed, and I don't know how it works in Ingham County, but in many situations, the defendant has to enter a guilty plea, but sort of a strange conditional one in which they agree that they plead guilty, but then if they comply with the conditions of the therapeutic court, such as the drug court, often a combination of therapy and other sort of reporting requirements, then in the end, eventually the case will be dismissed regardless. We don't have any information on those types of diverted cases so far, and they're a little bit more common. Right here, we're just talking about the first group, people who, if they're successful, the charges will never be filed. Specifically, when we compare young adults to everybody else here on the red line, just young adults as compared to everyone else we see, young adults are a little bit more likely to have their case diverted. Certainly possible that some of this is related to differences in charges. You might remember that young adults are a little bit more likely to be charged with theft and stolen property, and that's a much more common case which gets diverted. In fact, at one point, the majority of these diverted cases were overwhelmingly for misdemeanor drug possession. By 2018, that's no longer the case when there's very few cases of misdemeanor drug possession even submitted following the legalization of marijuana. To the point we get to 2018 and 2019, almost all cases which are diverted in this way are for misdemeanor theft and stolen property or felony theft and stolen property, and much more commonly the former than the latter. We look at differences among young adults by race here. You can see there was a little bit of a gap, about 3 percentage points in 2015, which seemingly persists all the way until 2018 before coming very close to being similar and somewhat lower for white young adults in 2019, around the same point here. Questions on that last section related to cases diverted? All right. Oh. No, that's okay. Then we'll go ahead and jump into the next section. Now this, for lack of a better term, I want to give something of a trigger warning here. I mean, this is some of the heaviest stuff I'm going to talk about. We're talking about young people under the ages of 17 here who are first initially have a warrant request submitted against them to see if they will be tried as an adult, and then in some cases are ultimately tried as an adult. By definition, these are minors, they're kids, often 15, 16 years old, usually who are accused of a very serious offense. That's what puts them in this lane in the first place, but who ultimately, if disposed, are very likely facing prison time, in some cases pretty serious prison time. That's incredibly heavy. It's a lot to comprehend. So I hope folks can take care of themselves. I'll do my best to move through this still, and to do so kind of gracefully and slowly. But I absolutely understand if folks want to take a break or pause periodically throughout. Just to give a little bit more kind of technical caveats to go along with that as well. I want to remind us that I'm talking about kids who are under the age of 17 at the time that the most serious offense associated with their case was submitted. I bring this up just to say that you may see reports elsewhere out there in the world that list slightly different numbers than the one we're going to show you tonight. There's a lot of different ways to measure age associated with somebody who has a case filed against them, especially when we're talking about serious charges. Sometimes that can take a couple of years to go all the way from a police report to a guilty disposition. And obviously, in the case of, say, a 15-year-old, that's the difference between 15 to 18. It can make a big difference if you're talking about who's a minor and who's not. Reason being that I want to focus on the time the offense was committed, and the reason being that we focus on the 17 to 25 range, really in general for young adults, but especially for kids here, is there's a pretty compelling case to be made about brain development. I think regardless of what time you're accused of the offense, if this occurs at this time that somebody's a minor, it seems like a pretty compelling case that they ought to be treated somewhat differently. That's not really my area of research, but happy to direct others to the information that's been shared with me. One more last little technical piece here, right? Just to return to this chart, so we also remember the extent to which this occurs as compared to the overall caseload. So again, height of these bars is the total number of warrant requests submitted. Position on the horizontal axis is the age of the person at the time of the offense associated with the submitted warrant request. Red shaded area is our 17 to 25-year-olds. This is who we're talking about in here. It is a very small portion of the entire caseload, less than 1%. The reason, I want to foreground this for two reasons. First of all, that is no consolation if it's you or your kid, right? But the fact is, whatever happens to these kids is not going to make a sizable impact in the overall racial disparities that we talk about. So I think this is an incredibly important issue, and this is why we highlight it specifically in these presentations, because otherwise these experiences are totally washed out in the overall aggregate data. But it is a very small portion of the overall caseload. What are we looking at here? This is the race and ethnicity of all of the kids for whom these cases were submitted against from 2015 to 2019. See an overrepresentation of Black people here relative to white people, very similar to the kind of overrepresentation we saw in felony cases submitted against young adults in general. I want to point out that the majority of these cases which are submitted do not go forward. So a lot of these cases are submitted by law enforcement. Relatively few of them ultimately result in a guilty disposition in which the minor under 17 is tried as an adult. Many of them are declined outright. In some cases, the charges are dismissed. In other cases, they're transferred down to juvenile court. There's all the various things that can fit into these other outcomes up here. To some extent, there may even just be limitations in our data here. So reflecting what we have access to, what's shown here is with the total proportion of these cases which are submitted, which ultimately have a guilty disposition on at least one charge. You can see that's about 30% of all the ones that come in 2019. Seemingly down from 2015 before, but pretty difficult to interpret considering the small numbers here. And ultimately, if we look at the race and ethnicity of all the kids who do have this guilty disposition, as we mentioned, the key takeaways right at the beginning, in 2019, 100% of these kids were Black. In fact, we see that consistently in other years as well, or very close to it in virtually every year that we look at. I want to pause here for a second. We have a couple more points for for this group of kids to talk about. But just before going there, just reactions, questions.
I think it's a lot to sit with, Andrew. We talk a lot about narrative change in our TRHT work and how powerful false narratives are and how they play into policing. And these numbers are disappointing, but we were talking in the chat in 2019, in August of 2019, Black youth around the city met with Chief Green to talk about these issues of over-policing and them not feeling safe. And, there were many discussions about making changes where our youth would feel safe. And looking at this data here, it just shows that we've got a lot of work to do. And so that's kind of where I'm reflecting right now, is just how this affects those that have cried out to our elected officials, to the community, and said, hey, we don't feel safe, and now we have it in front of us, right? The preponderance, 100% of those cases are black children. And so there's a narrative behind it that needs to be dismantled. So that's kind of where my mind is reflecting right now, Andrew. What do you think? Anybody else want to share and put in the comment section?
Mordecai, yeah, I'd like to actually jump in and provide a little bit of history here for those who may or may not have been involved in racial equity work prior to TRHT, but this timeline. So 2015 is when My Brother's Keeper was launched in the community. And December of 2014 is when the BLM chapter actually began to organize. So this timeline between 2015 and 2019 just coincides with some of the most direct and I'd say organized racial equity work in the community that had municipal leaders and systems leaders, including police chiefs as champions, who, you know, are at the table, and we're talking about policy and talking about transformation and looking at 21st century policing and how we make sure young people get a second chance. And this is what was actually happening while we were having those pleasant conversations over lunch. So understand why protest is absolutely necessary. Understand why disrupting the narrative is absolutely necessary. So I just want to be clear to those who, you know, who really don't understand why Black Lives Matter protests. Why can't we just sit at the table? You know, everybody wants to have a seat at the table. This is what happens when you settle for a seat at the table.
And we can't just go on as business as usual.
Thank you both for that additional history and all this. Huge.
I want to amplify a question from Jordan too, because I just want to make sure we're all seeing this correctly. So their question was, does it show basically that officers submitted many more warrant requests against youth under 17 in 2019 than in 2015? So like, does this mean that the numbers have gone up overall in terms of warrant requests submitted over the years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The simple answer is yes. The more complicated answer is that these are really low numbers in the first place. And so what sometimes looks like a really erratic jump in 2019, hard to say if that's really indicative of a pattern that would hold. And certainly 2020 is a very bizarre year, so it's hard to know necessarily what that increase means on face value. I would also say that in all these cases, when we talk about warrant requests, there's always the possibility of multiple warrant requests submitted against the same person or the same kid in this case. Generally, in these presentations, I don't spend a lot of time to belabor that point because we're talking about hundreds or thousands of people, and it's fairly rare that happens. So these differences often sort of wash out when we look at trends. They're more or less proportional from year to year. Here, we're talking about less than 10 kids per year sometimes. So if that happens even 3 or 4 times, that's enough to give the appearance of like this really large spike in 2019, for example. So it's the simple answer is yes, and the complicated answer is that it's complicated. It may not be as large of a spike as it appears.
I also would like to offer though that even if it is, and this is a retort that I've heard from police, you know, oh, it's the same person, you know, it's multiple cases against the same person, but the impact on that person to have multiple cases is also a really serious thing, because it feels like multiple cases, like it might. And it's a different experience to have multiple cases, especially when you're a child. So I hear you about that, and I haven't brought this up before, but I was thinking about cases when I was a prosecutor, and there would be multiple cases against one person, and seeing that person's face in court and knowing what they're dealing with on that side is just something that I think a lot of law enforcement take for granted just from my conversations with them.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for adding that too. Was there anything else if folks had questions or reflections they wanted to offer on any of this? Otherwise, we can press on with a couple extra findings related to this age range.
That's good. Andrew.
All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is the most serious offenses filed associated with, I should say, all of these cases, so all the warrant requests, which were at the very least submitted, if not filed. Not necessarily just the ones which are ultimately disposed as guilty. And so that's exactly what we're looking at here. This is the total number of cases filed against people under the age of 17, based on the most serious offense associated with those cases. You'll notice here, unlike before, we tend to look at charge categories. I can elaborate for probably what is far too long on why I like charge categories. But in this case, again, because the numbers are low enough, I figure we can also just look at the specific statutes, which is exactly what's shown here. So at the very top, we see nearly a third of these cases in 2019 related to armed robbery. Below that, breaking and entering. From here, the numbers get pretty small. We start to fracture about a bunch of different statutes, but there are some patterns we can pick up there. There is by the way, the police officer assaulting, resisting, obstructing that makes up most of our assaulting police category. A couple different types of criminal sexual conduct that show up. In many cases, these are very serious offenses. In other cases, the most serious charge appears to be related to weapons possession again. Which doesn't seem to be necessarily a crime of interpersonal violence again, right?
I also wanted to highlight here for folks that the disproportionality around robbery and armed robbery, I might be telling you something that you know already, but that is a national trend that Black male youth tend to get overcharged, or I don't like that term necessarily, tend to get charged for robbery, armed robbery related cases. And I saw that even as a prosecutor. And so folks who also are engaged in this work talk about, that being a result of the relationship in our culture between Blackness and dangerousness. I think this is another way in which it plays itself out. Aside from bail inequities, we see it in all inequities, but particularly for young people and for children, and Black youth. One could argue that it's really important to read what these statutes say around what gets defined as a robbery, because oftentimes robbery related cases are perceived as being very serious, but you can be charged with robbery without ever causing any physical injury to another person. And I think that that's something that's really important for people to understand. So I just encourage y'all to look at how certain conduct is defined in your state laws, because that's generally usually an overbroad statute.
Thank you for that, Jack. It's that kind of, I appreciate that, because I feel like the names behind the statutes can overplay the extent to which I feel like they're there to be debated by lawyers, right? So there's a lot more ambiguity than maybe the title suggests.
And I'm sorry, and I forgot to mention another thing. For weapons, the definition of a weapon doesn't only refer to guns, doesn't only refer to operable guns. It could refer to anything that could be used as a weapon. So robbery and an armed robbery can be a weapon that is not a gun. And it could be something where there was no physical injury. Not to say that that's the only sort of injury that matters, but I do think that that's an important distinction, because a lot of people make that association for that statute too. Okay, I'm done, I promise.
That's great. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm gonna move on to talk about warrant requests denied. I saw somebody left in the chat mentioned the phrase statistical noise. some might not be familiar with it. Here's a textbook representation of it, which is just to say that this is a very difficult trend to interpret. This is showing the total proportion of warrant requests submitted against kids under the age of 17 that were denied. And it is a very erratic trend. It bounces all over the place. It's hard to discern if there really is a trend. Reason being for that primarily is due to the fact that these are really small numbers. So as we were saying before, you know, a single extra kid or a single extra case which gets denied is enough to really skew this trend, and it makes it difficult to assess a pattern. One thing that is not all that difficult to assess, however, is if we break this up by race. And so shown here is the same information, but based on the race of the kid for whom these offenses were submitted against. And while it's true that it's still very erratic, it definitely appears that there is something of a pattern here, which is to say that it's a lot rarer that these warrant requests submitted against Black kids are denied than it is when they are submitted against white kids. In fact, we see in some years, all of the warrant requests submitted against white kids for this particular age range were denied. And then in many years, we see, in fact, almost every year, we see that it's a much, much lower proportion for the warrant requests submitted against Black kids. 2016, it's not the case. In fact, we see it's a situation where no warrant requests submitted against white kids were denied. We see, you know, these trends are sort of all over the place. So I would say, you know, classified as likely indication of a large disparity. Although it's hard to interpret from a stats perspective still. Questions on anything else in that section or anything that we want to go back to here? It's a couple framing things to cover here before we dive into this section, right? So first, we're talking about at the top. This section is going to be about, we're mostly talking about women as compared to men, very binary classification of gender. The risk of being totally redundant, I won't repeat everything at length, but basically this is due to the data we have. It has a lot to do with the way data are captured by police reports, which informs most of the demographic information we get. Again, you know, if we want to have a conversation about ways to change that, happy to try to go there or weigh in with whatever I know, but can bracket that off for now. But in terms of a larger framing for why we zero in on women, the fact is the majority of the caseload consists of cases filed against men. And so we talk about differences overall, as we did in the last presentation. Most of the time we're describing experiences that men have and not necessarily experiences that women have in the criminal legal system. In fact, in 2019, close to 75%, around 71% of all warrant requests submitted were submitted against men, meaning only about 28% of warrant requests submitted were submitted against women. Very easy to lose track of women's experiences that way. And this is a major problem because if we look at data from say 2000 to 2015, we would see that women are a growing segment of at least the carceral side of the criminal legal system. Specifically, we looked at jail populations from 2000 to 2015. Women's jail incarceration increased by 19%, while men's decreased by 5%. At least this is according to national figures. From 2015 to 2019, where most of our data is, it's a little bit more ambiguous. It's kind of hard to say. We don't necessarily have local Ingham trends for that matter. But regardless, this is a population we want to make sure we capture the experiences of. Might need different sorts of recommendations to reduce racial disparities. And that's not going to be highlighted unless we make an explicit effort to do so. Jumping right into that, what are we looking at here? This is the difference between, well, rather it's the total number of warrant requests submitted against men and women per 1,000 residents. We haven't looked at anything per 1,000 residents yet in this presentation, so to remind us all what we're talking about here. What this means roughly is that in 2019, out of every 1,000 people living in Ingham County, approximately 19.61 of them were men with a warrant request submitted against them. Same is then also true if we were to look at, say, out of approximately every 1,000 people living in Ingham County, about 7.82 of them were women with a warrant request submitted against them, give or take a small number of people with multiple cases submitted in 1 year. If you're wondering why I'm looking at all total residents instead of, say, total male and total female residents, the short answer is that it really doesn't make a difference. It would make these numbers larger, but the proportions would be the same. If you can see here, there's been a little bit of a larger, proportionally speaking, decline among men, but generally speaking, it's a little bit larger, a bit larger than it is among women. A lot of this, as we've seen in many other areas throughout these presentations so far, has to do with the disproportionate burden of different types of misdemeanor cases. And when the misdemeanors are going down, how that affects people differently. So first of all, on the left here, we see the total felony cases filed per 1,000 residents by gender. Fairly flat rates overall, decrease for both men and women. We look at the differences among misdemeanor cases filed, a much larger decrease. Specifically, this change from 10.75 per 1,000 residents to 8.33. It's about a 23% decrease for men, whereas this change from 4.2 to 3.7, it's about 12% decrease. We zero in on the differences between Black and white women. We see very large racial disparities that are fairly consistent over the entire time period. Specifically, if you compare these two numbers, so in 2019, we would say 22.99, or rather, out of every 1,000 Black people living in Ingham County, 22.99 of them were Black women with a warrant request submitted against them. Whereas out of every 1,000 white people living in Ingham County, 6.36 of them were white women with a case submitted against them. Suggests that Black women are about 3.6 times more likely than white women to have a case submitted against them, or a warrant request submitted rather. If for some reason you remember from last time when we looked at these exact same stats, but for the overall population, the disparities there were a little bit larger. It was closer to, I think, 5.5, suggesting it's a little bit larger for men, probably closer to 6 or 7. Sort of a moot point though. 3.6 is a very large disparity, and overrepresentation is still very consistently large. Questions on those last couple of charts? Otherwise, I'll move into warrant request denied.
I think if you can go back, Andrew, just to show that discrepancy. So, the criminalization of Black women, and I think it's really important. Really important to highlight here. And we're going to get into this. It's really important to highlight here that the misgendering and it is an issue in trying to understand the experience of women in particular. Not that it's not an issue for men, but just that we know that, trans women in particular are going to be we can't even get accurate numbers about this, but they're particularly overrepresented. But that aside, the ways in which Black women are perceived. So just as how, you saw that the robbery numbers for Black young people and disproportionately men or boys, for the disproportionality in the robbery for young Black kids, for example, comes out of this theme of dangerousness, right? For how Black folks are perceived. And so this on top of this perception that of the strong Black woman, right? And the inability to see Black women as being victims also is part of what compounds this experience here. And we're gonna see it kind of play out in the sort of charges and the differences in charges against both populations. But I think it's really important to recognize in this space that as much as we love to admire amazingly strong Black women that exist in society, there's a whole, there's an entire underbelly to that, which is why I would argue that there's no such thing as a good stereotype, right? There's a whole underside to this, and an inability of the system to recognize when Black women are victims of crime. And I saw that particularly acutely in the Domestic Violence Bureau, for example, when Black women were getting arrested and charged to defend when they were defending themselves against abusive situations. And again, this is a national trend that we that exists and that we are seeing, and that's why the amazing advocacy that needs that's gone on around recognizing all the different Black women who have been killed or and murdered by police. All of this is really relevant here because we need to recognize the ways in which the ugly ways in which society has that sort of history and stereotype, and the ways in which Black women are criminalized, and the question of whether or not Black people, and particularly Black women, particularly Black trans women, whether they even have a right to defend themselves. Because there are a lot of cases that come through where they are the victims if you were to sit and look at the facts, but they are the ones who are arrested.
Thank you for that, Jack. It's going to add a lot of context for everything we're about to look at. Hold a second here. There was a reaction to questions. Press on. Talking again about the differences in warrant requests submitted, which are ultimately denied, meaning nothing happens with them. They don't go forward in any way. Looking first here at the differences between men and women, we can see women slightly more likely than men to have their warrant request denied. Slightly over the same time period. Relatively small gap still in 2019, but certainly larger than it was in 2015. We look at the differences between Black and white women, shown here over here on the left. We see another one of these more erratic trends, although population is not necessarily a concern here. It's kind of interesting, not entirely clear exactly, to be totally honest, what to make of it. We do see a 2 percentage point gap in 2019, where white women are a little bit more likely than Black women to have their warrant request denied. We see that varies over the time period, despite a larger gap in 2015. Could suggest that there's a lot of reasons that drives this. There's of course some larger statistical questions about what does this mean for differences as a group. Either way, there's still a gap in 2019. And whether or not this means it's closing and it's going to stay close to even way out into 20 and 21, hard to say. In contrast, though, if we look at the proportion of warrant requests submitted which are denied with Black men versus white men, we see a much larger gap. Initially, this looks quite a bit like what we might have seen in the overall population, part due to what I was saying at the very beginning, most of the population being men. But we see that generally a little bit lower than women in the first place, but that this grows pretty rapidly for white men from 17% up to 26% in 2019, whereas for Black men, it goes from around 18% to around 20%. A little bit flatter, a much smaller growth. Move into talking about warrant request diverted, but any questions on those last two slides? Remember, again, these are the pre-charge diverted cases. Just important to remember that this isn't the entire universe of all cases that are diverted. This is a specific type of diversion, mostly consisting of, in 2019, theft and stolen property cases, primarily misdemeanor theft and stolen property cases, but some felony ones as well. And in previous years, consisting mostly of misdemeanor drug possession, really specifically marijuana. But as that's legalized, that theft's become a larger burden, or a larger portion rather, of the diverted cases. What do we see here? We see women a little bit more likely than men in the red on the top, as opposed to the charcoal color there, to have their case diverted. I mean, overall, these numbers are pretty low for these specific types of diverted cases, especially large spike in 2018 for whatever reason. We'll see in a minute that this is very likely due to the fact that it seems like women are more likely to be accused of some sort of theft and stolen property charge. We certainly see that they're more likely to be charged with it. So to whatever extent that reflects the charges that are coming in as well, might explain a large portion of this gap. We look at the differences between Black and white women and between Black and white men. On the left, again, another somewhat difficult to interpret trend here. See very similar rates for Black and white women from 2015 to about 2017. Then there's an enormously large spike in the number of white women who had their case submitted to diversion, back to a little bit of a closer proportion, although still a 2 percentage point gap in 2019. Totally honest, not entirely sure what to make of that. Something that I think deserves more research, trying to understand exactly what could be going on there. In contrast, for men, we see that there's just sort of a consistent downward trend. There's a gap between Black and white men of about 2 percentage points, slowly sort of converging into 2019. If I wanted to speculate, it could be that this is due to the changes in what's going on with misdemeanor drug cases being forwarded to the office, and men in general being a little bit less likely than women to be charged with theft and stolen property cases. So could be, but that's explaining what's going on there. Hard to say. Ultimately, will take us into the cases that are being charged. So everything that finally does go forward. On the left here, this is the total number of felony cases filed, but which were specifically filed against women, as I was just hinting at. We can see right up at the top there, felony theft and stolen property, far the largest, followed by drug possession. CWC, as we mentioned, our key findings, assaulting a police officer. Now remember, this includes a very ambiguous statute. And as Jack was saying before, there's a lot of interpretation that may go into these statutes. Sort of unexpected to see it in the top 5, right?
I was thinking the same thing, Andrew.
Compare these to the top felony categories filed against men, and yeah, they're pretty different. It's a very large change in the theft and stolen property there. Smaller for assaults. Pretty close for assaulting a police officer, but look at the differences in misdemeanor charges filed against women as compared to men. On the left, we're looking at misdemeanor cases filed against women. On the right, misdemeanor cases filed against men. Biggest difference, I mean, overwhelmingly there is theft and stolen property once again, right? A lot more of the cases submitted against women, almost a quarter of all the misdemeanor cases. Some differences in the domestic battery stuff. But again, we point out from where we had in key findings, I would say this is probably higher than I expected. And the kind of thing I think we really want to start to investigate more what's going on in these kinds of cases. Look at differences among women, but by race. On the left here, these are the top felony charges filed against Black women. Callback to exactly what Jack was talking about at the top. We see right up there, the very top is assault and battery, followed by theft and stolen property. Numbers start to get kind of low from there on out. Compare these to the charges which are filed against white women. Pretty big differences. Theft and stolen property is relatively close, but a big difference in drug possession. Assaulting a police officer, one again, you know, a lot going on with the statutes that we want to try to understand there, I think. Bigger differences in assault and battery in general. And misdemeanor cases broken down in the same way, Black women on the left, white women on the right. Again, the biggest difference, and jumps right out to me, I guess, this theft and stolen property thing. A very large portion of misdemeanor cases filed against white women. Minor differences in this domestic battery, this misdemeanor assault and battery. A relatively large difference there too. And then again with these DUIs, different.
I'm wondering if folks have any sort of reflections just on that previous slide and this one about these about the top charges filed and how that hits you between the felony and or the misdemeanor. You know, based on how you understand your community to be and what you see and what you experience, what your loved ones or friends experience, especially, you know, for these top categories.
Jack, I was thinking about the turn my camera. I was thinking about the numbers when we were looking at the youth, right? 17 to 25 on armed robbery. You were making the point, and then looking at theft and stolen property, and on both sides, right? And so I was like, wow, there's a lot of interaction. There's a lot of, you know, and so that's kind of where I was thinking and reflecting was how consistent these charges are with the charges for the youth.
And Mordecai, something that we will be able to do, we just didn't have it for today, is we can break down those youth charges by gender. if we want to isolate Black girls, Black boys, and see, what if there's, if we can see that connection. Because, when I think of it as a pipeline, we can see how your girls are getting impacted specifically, and how that connects to this.
I was also thinking, at what point in an officer's mind does he feel like he's being assaulted by a woman? Like, there's no granularity there. There's a lot of ambiguity, but what I see is that we have a real issue. Obviously, we knew this with just how the system sees Blackness overall, but then drilling down to, this particular slide, it's, I feel like there are so many people in our community that don't have representation. They're caught in this net, and so I've just really been deeply thinking about, are we able to process these cries that are coming from our community? Because I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of where my reflections are. Anyone else want to add to Jack's question?
All right. If nothing else, that will pretty much do it for all the findings that we're going to look at today. So we'll just give a little bit some next steps, and then maybe a little bit of a recap of our key findings so we know how to end this. Talking about our next steps, from some of the stuff on the Vera side in the first 2 bullet points, we did prepare for the office a very long, very, very long written document, which captures a lot of the findings we've talked about in these presentations, but also gives a lot more context. A lot of the stuff that frankly I say in the presentations, but which you wouldn't necessarily get if you just looked at the slide decks without me talking. At some point that'll be available publicly, I believe. If not, we can find a way to share it or something like that for those who are interested in reviewing it on their own. We are going to continue to do more analysis as well. We've talked a lot about things we hope to keep looking at. Hopefully we'll get to most of that, and it will make its way into either future presentations or some sort of future written document. But then from there, I think the next steps, the policy discussions, and Jack, sorry, you can elaborate on that a lot more than me in terms of where we're going in that direction. And then I think in the spirit of, since we've been talking so much about young adults as 17 to 25-year-olds, worth pointing out the raise the age coming into effect, which will at least change that to 18 to 25-year-olds as far as I know. I'm sure somebody on this call probably knows the details more than I do. Let's see, and then with that, I think we'll turn it over for some more general discussion. Just to remind us all, these are the kind of key findings that we started with. We can come back to this periodically in the discussion if we like. Which of course we're our best guess at key findings, but they don't necessarily have to be the same ones that resonate with everybody else. Certainly things stuck out to us. Thank you all. I'll give it back to Mordecai here. It's in the next direction.
Thank you, Andrew. What an amazing, presentation, and I think it's there's so many different reflections that we have, and I think for many of us, we're asking, what further policy changes need to be made, right, to really, turn the corner on some of these numbers. And how do we advocate for that, and who do we advocate for? And we got to continue to educate our community. And so we want to thank Jack and Sarah and Andrew for just all of the work again. And Angela, you have any closing comments before we give our call to action? Our next Lansing People's Assembly is on September 25th from 2 to 4. And we're going to ask you to respond. We're going to ask you to invite other citizens to be a part that haven't been a part of the assembly. And so that's our call to action, is to show up. Now that we have the data, now we have to show up and we've got to organize, and right. And so the second call to action that we're going to ask you to do is to respond to the opening question that was placed around why is the Ingham sheriff so opposed to the recent policy changes, and you all have seen the news and the articles. Why is he so opposed to these changes that are founded in facts and the data? And so we have a couple questions. I see a hand is up in the from Joy. So Joy, if you want to put your question in the chat or come off mute, and you can ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much. My question really comes from a very current event. Today in South Carolina, a prominent lawyer who came forward and confessed to several crimes was released on $20,000 bail. And so that's sitting with me as we're going through this information. And I wonder about kind of a little bit of the other side, and some of the other side of the information was given, but should we work, would it also help equity to not have things like that happen? Because I just can't believe that if it was a Black man, the bail would be $20,000 for someone who's a multimillionaire. That there needs to be something that makes the standard the same for everybody, and less ability for judges to discretionarily put out these types of bails. And I can imagine it going on into the sentencing as well. But that as we go forward, and I think that with the youth, that's the most important thing that we can advocate for and work to affect change in, but also equity in the entire system, that it's not just that they're oppressive to certain segments of society, but that they're also very permissive to others as well. And so, like I said, I'm sitting with that, and it is something, bothersome that I'd like to see us be able to make a difference in as well.
Thank you, Joy. And yeah, that whole case that you referred to, the body count is stacking up around him, and I mean, it is the perfect example of the inequity that we've been looking at on our slides that exists in the system. We have in the comment section, the entire cash bail system needs to be eliminated, right? And so, I mean, you covered that in I think parts 1 and 2. Anyone else have any reflections? We're reading the comment section, so.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to add a little bit more context for the question that we are inviting you to respond to. And I see we have Chris Root on the call. And so Chris, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I do want to offer the opportunity, because I want to just share, if for those of you who are not East Lansing residents, or perhaps, didn't watch the meeting last night, or, attend the meeting, that first, I want to thank and really lift up the leadership of East Lansing's mayor and city council, and that who demanded that Sheriff Rigglesworth actually make public his request of city officials to sign a statement in opposition to the policy changes. And through that meeting, through that public presentation, we learned that the sheriff has been having meetings with municipal leaders throughout the county and asking them to sign on to this statement. So I'll just pause there, Chris, and see if you want to share anything, since that's your community and you've been really working on this on the same process or similar process in East Lansing.
Angela, unfortunately, I came late tonight. Was there any discussion about last night's meeting earlier in this session?
We did not discuss the meeting. We started with framing a question for folks to think about, and our call to action today is for people to respond to
Right.
why Sheriff Rigglesworth would oppose these policy changes
Right,
when we present so much evidence.
right. Well, it was a really important meeting, I think. And I think what some folks were trying to get across is that the discussion he wants to have about opposing this policy is the opposite of the discussion that we need to be having, which is about moving beyond, adding to the direction that Carol Seaman was going. And so we were talking about, what can the East Lansing City Council do itself in terms of prosecutions in East Lansing? Because, we hire the city council hires the city attorney who does the local prosecutions. And there was reference to the fact that the city council has adopted a resolution declaring racism a public health crisis, which was the same sort of basis that the prosecutor was working out of in her policy change. So, I think there was a strong defense made last night that we should not go along with the sheriff, but there was also an effort to say it's the wrong conversation entirely. We need to be going in a better direction with policy, and that's what we need to be about. But I agree, it was terribly important that this became public. It was no surprise that Rigglesworth has been organizing on this because he brought together the police chiefs on 2 occasions. But to think that he'd been going privately to elected officials throughout the county and that they had been signing on, it reminds me where we're living. And that we need to keep doing work in our particular communities and also need to have a bigger geographical focus as well. It's just horrible to think that all these people just signed on because he came and asked them to. And as you point out, he didn't have any evidence that the policy he was advocating actually would reduce gun violence. And yet he was saying, this is the magic, we have to oppose this, we can't do this. And he brought no rationale for it. And the example he gave for East Lansing was false, which was pretty stunning. So those are some reactions.
How many signed on? Was it
He said he
21
has
out of
21
23?
signatures from elected officials in townships and villages and cities in Ingham County. It sounded like he went to 23 people and all but 2 signed on. So that's the mood that is around us.
Well, I mean, I don't want to sell propaganda short, because we just have to look at recent history and the difference that it makes to go to somebody one-on-one and to make your case when no one is going to oppose you and really doesn't understand the issue.
Right.
Because it's not a prevalent issue in their community, and who, because of the world that we live in and how we got where we are, to bring TRHT into this conversation, the reality that that law enforcement was created out of and works to maintain racial hierarchy. Like, to really understand that there's a reason that TRHT Lansing like immediately realized that we needed to expand the footprint and that we really needed to be TRHT Metro Lansing. And one of the conversations we continue to have is, how do we not preach to the choir? And the reality is that even in the face of the data, even in the face of truth, this country is so traumatized and disaffected. And I mean, honestly, we're being terrorized by disinformation. And I also have to point out that Michigan Sheriff's Association is putting their muscle behind this. So it's very political.
Right.
And for those who may not know, just Google Michigan Sheriff's Association, Google some of the ideology in Michigan in particular, or even across the country about sheriffs in particular, as the only official body of law enforcement. I mean, there's a lot that came out with the protests at, I don't even want to call it a protest, but when there was the audition at the Michigan State Capitol for what ultimately happened at the National Capitol, and there was a plot to kidnap the governor. We actually had sheriffs who supported these white supremacist, white domestic terrorist groups. So like, we have to understand the full context and how dangerous it is for law enforcement to use the power of their office and our tax dollars to undermine safety of the community.
Mhm.
I mean, we're talking about people's lives. It's not just, statistics on a page.
Mhm.
So thank you so much, Chris. I know I put you on the spot, but, and also I would love to invite you just to share a little bit about the work that you've been doing with East Lansing, because we really do need to expand this conversation. It has to be a regional conversation. If we didn't understand that before, the data that we're looking at should make that plain to us.
Mhm. Well, another thing that's going on in East Lansing is that the city council did adopt an ordinance to create a new police oversight commission. And we were pleasantly surprised that the ordinance that they passed was very, very similar to what the study committee, which was a citizens group, recommended to them. And Eric Williams, who's a phenomenal lawyer who's been working on these issues for a decade, just had a tremendous impact on the shape of that ordinance as one of the members of the study committee. 39 people have applied. I think appointments will be made in October. The folk who made that recommendation have no, I can't think of the right word. We know that an oversight commission doesn't solve all that much. It does go well beyond just looking at individual complaints. There's all kinds of opportunities for recommendations about policy and for collecting and analyzing and making public data. So I think, my hope is that it will be a forum for ways for people to engage, to learn more, to use this body for organizing and pushing. So we'll see where we can go with that. There's a oversight commission in Ann Arbor that's been going for 2.5 years. And I've been watching their meetings, and they're very interested in sharing their learnings with people elsewhere in the state. And I'm sure that, there will be some communication. And I think another thing is Angela, I think you're really good at, we need data, but also data can be very problematic. And so you always need to be listening to real people as well. and I think we have to keep doing both. And I hope that the Oversight Commission will do both. Will both try to put together some serious data analysis and really do outreach into the community so that people feel comfortable coming forward with their experience and recommendations.
Thank you, Chris. There's a follow-up question here from Jack. Will the oversight group have the ability to discipline and or fire officers?
You probably know the answer to that, Jack. No. There is a union contract. The only people who can discipline or fire and hire are supervisors. So really, the police chief usually does that. The only thing that can go higher than that is the city manager, because he is the supervisor of the police chief. But politics matters a great deal too. There were, before George Floyd's murder, there were 2 Black men who were treated physically abusively by a white police officer in East Lansing. And complaints were filed, and eventually the charges were dropped against these 2 men of resisting the police officer. I would say that the second of those charges that were dropped because of George Floyd. That shouldn't be the case. Obviously, the system should work well enough that if there are ridiculous things that a police officer does, I mean, there was absolutely no danger whatsoever in either of these situations. The people were just standing there. I mean, they were not involved in anything dangerous to public safety or to the police. And yet they were, brought down to the ground in less than a minute. It shouldn't take a Black man dying for the cases against them to be dropped. So organizing matters, even if the system, only has these little, appears to have these enormous limitations on what the public can do. And a month after the second charge was dropped, the police chief retired early. He was retirement age, but he was not planning to retire at that time. So organizing matters.
Thank you, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so context. That's really, I wanted to make sure you had that context for the question, just in case you haven't had a chance to, follow and weren't aware of this disclosure that was only revealed through a public forum because a leader asked for it.
Mm-hmm.
The 21 people who signed off on that statement could have also done so in a public forum. So yay, Mayor Jesse Gregg. Yeah.
And Dana Watson was at her best.
Oh, yes, just reading
He was so firm.
Well, and the questions about, so the data, and honestly, you've paid lip service to supporting Black Lives Matter and racial equity, and Sheriff Rigglesworth, at the request of a judge, actually provided us with a list of Black moms that we could bail out for Mama's Day, and that's what I mean about the kind of I don't want to call it performative, but how easy it is to do things that on the surface, like it's all about the optics, but ultimately are not transformative and actually aren't changing the material conditions of people's lives. And the statements that the sheriff is making are so openly and unashamedly anti-Black. that there's no way, and I think Dana, like, she was so clear in that he knows the data and that he's been involved, and the position that he's taking now, that yes, it's a problem, but it's not his problem. And it's very clear that he firmly believes that racially biased policing is the only way that he can do his job. So that's my end quote. So for those of us who are in this People's Assembly and building a Breathe Act, just a reminder that prosecutorial justice is one of our sections. So when we think about the response to these policies that could go further, and what a model policy would look like, and I'm going to say short of abolition, because that's my dream, but short of abolition, what does harm reduction really look like in the role of the prosecutor, understanding the power that they actually have to disrupt the school to prison pipeline, the cradle to prison pipeline. So I want us to be thinking about that, because we really wanted to dive deep into this data, because we know we actually have to justify. We can't come into a room with that kind of power without data. So we're so grateful to Carol Seaman for her commitment to TRHT. And from the onset, she's like, I don't want to come to a bunch of meetings. I want to do some real work. And this is the real work. And I want to thank Vera for jumping in with us and for helping us really understand the story behind the data, because the same data could be used to actually further harm our community. And your partnership in the analysis and the discussion is just so vital and much appreciated. So I'll turn it back to whoever wants to take us out of here.
I just wanted to name that I shared a resource in the chat, because now that we're talking about, policy, our project, we have motionforjustice.org, which is a website that kind of gives a perspective and recommendations on the sort of policies that prosecutors can adopt that could get at these racial inequities that we see. But they're a little high level, there's some information. So I just encourage y'all to check it out, motionforjustice.org. And now that you've been through, these conversations, it might make more sense to you now, to check it out and keep it in mind. And, we're here for these conversations. Thanks.
Thank you, Jack. I'm gonna ask everyone just show some love for Andrew, Sarah, and Jack in the comment section. We certainly appreciate all of your work, and whether you throw up an emoji or send them a message, we want you to know how much we appreciate. Andrew, thank you for stepping down through these murky waters over the last 4 sessions, and again, just the entire team at Vera. We appreciate each of you, and so we're going to again put the call out to meet us for our next People's Assembly on the 25th, and we're asking you to actually sit with the question and email it. Email your answer to us, right? And you could send it to either one of our addresses that we'll put in the comment section, but we really want to elevate your voices. And so the email address is connect@oneloveglobal.org. That's all we have for tonight, and we wish everyone have a wonderful, wonderful evening.